Hello everyone, Charles Howarth here, and today I want to take you through a short video giving you my insights from a recent article that I've just read called A New Joule Order that was published by Carlyle, the investment company. And it highlights the concept of a security premium in the energy space, and this really supporting the energy transition. Now, the interesting thing about the global energy markets is that we've had a very heavy reliance on fossil fuels over the past 60, 70 years, really after World War II. And this has really been enabled by global trade supported by the US, who have been acting as the police with the US Navy and securing global trade lanes. Now, one of the beautiful things about fossil fuels is you have very, very high energy density in a commodity which you can reasonably easily store and transport. So you can take this energy from a producer and you can easily transport it globally as long as global trade and security is in place and all the countries are playing nicely together. Now, I read about a year ago a really interesting book called Disunited Nations by Peter Zahan, and he talks about the US actually moving away from wanting to be the global police and securing global trade and actually becoming a lot more inwardly focused. And in that book, he discusses what the consequences would be on the world, on countries, and on geopolitics. And this article is very much in that vein, looking at, well, what happens now if global trade and trade between countries starts to break down or starts to reduce? And if we go onto the first chart that was from the report, what you can see here is across the three main regions. So if you have a look at the US, what this shows is the energy production. So the yellow/orange bars here show in the United States their domestic fossil fuel production. And what you can see is that they were importing fossil fuels for many years, from the 80s through to around 2015-16. And since around 2016 onwards, the amount of homegrown production of energy has made them actually a net exporter. And that means they don't have a need anymore to rely on securing their own energy supplies from foreign countries. Now, I'll switch across to China. And actually, China is a very, very big importer. And if you look at the behavior of China over the past 10, 20 years, they've spent a significant amount of energy trying to, one, grow their homegrown production, primarily through coal, and also secure their energy imports. And what we also see from China is that they've started to ramp up in the last 10 years or so their production of non-fossil fuel sources, that being wind, solar, nuclear, and hydro. And that's really starting to grow so they can really reduce their reliance on imported fossil fuels. The odd one out here is Europe. And what you can see in Europe is that they've actually become pretty vulnerable. So if you have a look at the orange bars in the middle, you'll see that Europe's homegrown production of fossil fuels has been falling over time. What we see is that non-fossil fuel sources is also growing, and Europe has taken a good position in having non-fossil fuel sources, but actually it's only making up for the gap in the domestic production. And if we look at the statistics, we see that since the 80s, the amount of fossil fuel imports as a percentage of the energy use has increased from 38% up to 54%. And that puts Europe in a very, very vulnerable position. Interestingly, if you go back a bit further in time and have a look at the 70s, there was a lot of worries, and around the 60s and 70s, that's where actually the US built out its nuclear fleet. And why did that happen? Well, in that time, the US was really worried about peak oil and that their production of oil was going to fall off. Everyone was following this thing called Hubbert's curve. What happened, though, is that shale arrived, shale oil and shale gas. And instead of the US needing to rely on nuclear plus imported fossil fuels, they actually never went through peak oil, and shale really launched this production of homegrown fossil fuels for the US. So what's going to happen going forward? If trade starts to slow down, we're going to see, particularly in places like Europe, that rather than focusing on the green premium for having decarbonization and lower CO2 emissions, you're going to start to see a security premium coming. And this is going to impact all, significant amounts of future investments in energy infrastructure. I mean, China didn't expand its renewable and nuclear fleets for climate change. They actually were working on renewable generation and nuclear to secure their own supply, so they didn't have to rely on foreign countries. And it was about giving them energy, economic freedom, and energy security. And actually, Chinese fossil fuel imports peaked in 2019 and has now started to fall. But in that time frame, they've doubled down on battery storage and domestic energy production. The other thing that happens as a side effect of focusing on this security premium is that these secure homegrown sources of power generation also happen to be sources of low carbon generation as well. And an interesting one, if you have a look at this chart, which compares the emissions intensity by country, all of which thankfully is falling over time. But what you can see is France is a real outlier, having an extremely low emission intensity of its power generation. And interestingly enough, that's driven because the majority of France's electrical power is produced by nuclear. And why did that happen, you might ask? It's because France was worried about its energy independence from Algeria and wanted to move away from Algerian hydrocarbon imports. And that's when they started moving across to building their reactor fleet. And as a result, they've got a very independent power supply. They have kind of an independent economic outcome as a result, and extremely low carbon emissions. So they get all of them. And this is a good reason why nuclear can really start to play here in combination with wind and solar, hydro, and batteries. But Europe is really in an energy crisis now. The reality is that Europe has really underinvested in its energy infrastructure, in particular grids. Really, there's a quagmire for new renewable developers trying to deploy new power generations, a quagmire of permitting, grid connection, regulations, and 100 other things that are slowing down. To develop a project today in Europe, in most countries, takes easily 10 years from kind of first identifying sites through to getting projects delivered, and this can be way longer if you look at some of the larger scale energy infrastructure, in particular nuclear, offshore, etc. So this is going to be a real problem for Europe going forward, and they're going to have to figure out how to address this, and they're going to have to take into account not just the levelized cost of energy of what's being produced, but also factor in, as well as the green premium, the security premium, and the time frame to help get that security and build the homegrown power. The other thing to say is that some of these low carbon sources and some of these homegrown sources of renewables start to put intermittency on. The graph on the left is in Germany. It looks at the volatility of power prices, and what you can see is that from 2021 onwards, there have been extreme shocks and volatility in power prices. This is really being driven by Russian gas and the Ukraine invasion, but that is then overlaid also with intermittent renewables, and you have the double whammy where they start to lose control of their own power and energy pricing in the country. And so security really plays. The good thing that we do see on the right-hand side is that Germany has really been decarbonizing and being on a strong decarbonization journey, implementing renewables. But what you see is they shut off nuclear, and they've then spiked up on coal, which is really not the right direction to go, to be honest with you. The last thing that I would kind of highlight as anyone's thinking about this energy infrastructure and how the world is changing is it's really important to think on a 20+ year time horizon, because any renewable project that gets built today, sorry, I shouldn't say renewable, any energy infrastructure project that gets built really is going to be looking at a 20+, it could be 30, 40, 50 year in the case of nuclear, time horizon. And so there are a number of things to think through which are related. One thing recently that's really impacted is rising cost of capital. So interest rates have risen in the last 2 or 3 years. This has really impacted the capex heavy industries, that being renewables, nuclear. As an example, by doubling the interest rates, or by going from 2% to 4%, you actually end up slashing the present value of the project by about 16%. So it makes it a bit more difficult for these capex heavy projects to go ahead. It means that the cost of those projects goes up slightly. They're still ultra competitive, but it is having an impact on the industry and slowing things down. But on the flip side, with fossil fuels, which are less capex heavy and more operating expenses and dependent on the cost of fuels, there's a requirement to forecast what will the cost of fuels be, the supply of fossil fuels be out for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And if we see the world starting to be impacted by geopolitical tensions, trade tariffs, wars interrupting supply, it's also a very risky and difficult decision to make on those long timeframes, especially if you assume that climate change is continuing to be a problem. We see more and more climate disasters, and eventually people are going to start taking action on CO2 emissions. That also makes fossil fuel investments more difficult. So how this will play out in the coming years is going to be very interesting to see. I fundamentally believe that this dynamic is going to push for more low carbon assets, but actually instead of under this green premium, under the security premium. The other thing to think about is the trading of energy. So we mentioned that the fossil fuels are fantastic because they're easy to trade across borders. And what's very interesting is that electricity is not really traded in a significant way. Less than 1% of global electricity is actually traded across borders compared to fossil fuels. And then the question is, so what happens there? I do believe there's going to be a lot more interconnectors, but really with nearest neighbors to help balance up some of the grid systems. There's an open question mark about green fuels, so hydrogen, blue or green hydrogen, whether that is a way of capturing stranded electricity and then moving it to demand centers. But equally, if the world is tightening down and trade's becoming more difficult, that could also become more difficult for those alternative fuels. And then the question is, are we going to see more tariffs, more border taxes, and how quickly are we going to see this pressure coming on these traded commodities? So that's it. I just wanted to run you through, share my thoughts. It's a really fascinating space. The next few years will be interesting to follow. For those of you that have been following me, you'll know that I'm still a big proponent and believer in renewables and the decarbonization energy transition. I actually think this dynamic and potentially the erratic behavior of certain presidents who's threatening tariffs and having an anti-trade stance in many ways could be a catalyst for real growth in renewable nuclear hydro generation, especially outside of the United States. So watch this space. Comment down below if you agree, disagree, or want to join the debate. Follow me on my socials, and I will speak to you all in the next video soon. Thank you.